Since 9/11, the nation has called upon the 155th to deploy twice into Iraq, in 2004 and again in 2009. In both deployments, the brigade answered the call and accomplished every mission given to it, adding to its rich 220-year history of service to Mississippi and the United States.
The leaders and soldiers of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team are here at Fort Bliss engaged in tough, realistic, and demanding combined arms training that is honing every element of the PCT's combat power that can be brought to bear against any enemy.
Mississippi's own 155th Armored Brigade, Dixie Thunder, as it conducts its final preparations to deploy this summer into the Central Command area of operations.
Basically a good opportunity to validate our tactics and procedures on how we control and synchronize our different fire assets. So all the way down from direct fire weapon systems, all the way up to Shadow and Gray Eagle support. That's to include the Apaches and field artillery and everything that we can bring to bear. And we're just practicing on how we can synchronize those efforts.
Roger. 3 destroyed T-72s, 1 BMP.
All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brigadier General John Richardson. I'm the Director of Operations, Readiness, and Mobilization and Headquarters DA, G357. I'm joined by the Deputy Director, Brigadier General Mark Strong. And we're going to talk to you today about Army mobilization and how we're evolving Army mobilization of the reserve component to meet the current national defense strategy, national security strategy, national defense strategy as we make this transition away from the war fight that we've seen over the last decade. It's been more coin focused to one that potentially would require a larger mobilization up to a full mobilization and ensuring that the Army is prepared to meet the nation's need when it comes to employing the total force. And I think we're going to couch this and frame it in where we were, where we are, and where we're going. To kind of put it in context, Army mobilization in the modern era under the total force. And that really goes back, I think you go back to General Abrams after Vietnam, coming out of Vietnam, a war that was not popular in the nation, a war that we lost strategically. And when he came out of Vietnam and he became the Chief of Staff of the Army, he created a policy of total Army. And the concept was that never again would the Army go to war, large-scale contingency operation without the nation. And you do that by bringing the reserves and the National Guard with you if you go to fight. And so that was the policy, total Army up until Desert Storm. And then we reached Desert Storm. Next slide, sorry. And a number of lessons came out of Desert Storm, because really what General Abrams envisioned was that the reserve component would be a strategic reserve, and that if we ever were to deploy, fight a war at a large scale, that we would, at the strategic level, we would need to call on the reserves, both the reserve and the National Guard. Desert Storm, first major combat operation after Vietnam, and we saw some hiccups in the process, and we found some faults in the policy. First, so we did employ the reserves as with the enablers, with the active components very successfully, but then there were some challenges with the National Guard. And the question really became, were we mobilizing the National Guard as a strategic reserve, or we were trying to use them as an operational reserve? And if we were going to use them in an operational manner, then had we equipped them, had we trained them, and did we have the installation support that would be required for that level of a mobilization for that type of conflict? And so you go into the 90s, you see a reduction in the number of active duty. You've got the wall has come down, and we have the peace dividend, and you have a great reduction in the active component, and really almost a leveling of active versus reserve, which was really in the spirit of the total Army that General Abrams envisioned. Next slide. And so we have 9/11, and 9/11 has changed how we have used the reserve component. And if you think through what we faced really from let's go from 2003 to 2014 or 2008, a lot of pressure put onto the active component in a campaign that's long in time but not large in numbers at any given time. And so we started to use the reserve component, and specifically some National Guard units, almost in a, we put them in a batting order under Army Force Generation. And in that concept, you had time. It was very predictable mobilization. You had a train up. It wasn't decisive action. It was coin focused. And so you had time to identify, train, properly equip, and then deploy the reserve component in the Army Force Generation model. As we've come out of Iraq and Afghanistan in large numbers, 11, 12, 13, 14, the Army also came to the realization that we had to look at our next major threat and put our eye back on the ball on large-scale operations. And so we started training the total force back into decisive action rotations. And they really put into question then, are we really prepared for mobilizing on the large scale? Because as we look at the national security strategy, national defense strategy, we're looking at near-peer threats. And we're looking at great power competition. And when you think about where that could lead, and if it was to lead to conflict, you're talking about a large-scale contingency operation, and not the small-scale contingency operations that we saw with OEF and OIF. And so then we have to ask ourselves as we look at our current conditions, and I think the best one to look at there is your installations. We reduced our power projection platforms and our MG mobilization force generation installations, your MFGIs, we reduced down to 2 by 2014, Fort Bliss and Fort Hood. And so we asked ourselves, next slide. You asked ourselves, if we were to fully mobilize, did we have the capacity to do that? And so really right now what the Army is looking at, as we look at not only manning, training, equipping, but also installations, and have we made the investment, do we have the resources that if the nation was to call on the Army to mobilize, fully mobilize, do we have the capacity to do that, to fulfill our requirements in the National Defense Strategy? And so as you look at manning currently, again, we got a balanced force between the active component and the reserves. We've transitioned our training, and we're investing into decisive action for our reserve components. As you can see there, for CTC rotations, 4 CTC rotations a year for the National Guard. In addition to that, we have the National Guard 4.0, where we're actually investing more training days into certain high-impact units, ABCTs, in the National Guard, where on their 4-year training cycle, their first year they have 39 days, the traditional 39 days of active duty training. Year 2, 48, year 3, 60, and year 4, 60 days of active duty training days to better prepare them for decisive action, mobilization, and potential large-scale contingency warfight. In addition to that, in their third year, they have what's called an XCTC, externally evaluated CTC rotation at a home station. The example would be the 48th IBCT out of the Georgia National Guard. Recently did first their XCTC in 2017 at Fort Stewart, Georgia, evaluated by the 3rd Infantry Division, resourced by the 3rd Infantry Division as far as OCs, OPFOR, etc. And then the following year, 2018, went on to a CTC rotation before a eventual deployment. And so where we're investing is training, we're investing in equipment, and that's a challenge. It always is a challenge when it comes to ensuring that we have interoperability not only with our partners and our allies, but also between the active component and the reserve component as we try to maintain commonality in equipment during transitions. And then right now, a lot of investment being made by FORCECOM into installations and to ensure that we've got the resources and the capability that if we were called to mobilize the reserve component in a large scale, that we have the resources at the MFGIs to provide the combat power required for fulfilling the war plans. So with that, what I'd like to do is just open up questions for either myself or General Strong on the concept of Army mobilization.
Hello, sir. John Vaughn, Raytheon. My question has to deal with high-density, low-demand units and how they, some of your challenges in dealing with the force gen model for, say, like THAAD batteries or something that's like really small numbers and trying to maintain the force generation.
Hey, sir, great question, and I'll field that. So one of the things that from the Army mobilization side of the house is that we've gone kind of, as we're moving away from a rotational model of Army force generation into a sustainable readiness model. That sustainable readiness model allows us to set the conditions based on given demand for how much we're asking of those high demand, low density forces. So that's a kind of a shift of the way that we're looking at things. It allows us to prepare for and support decisive action versus kind of a known contingency rotation that we did into the CENTCOM AOR for many years. Thanks, sir.
Cool. Bob Harder, Army Reserve. Johnny, good to see you, brother. So I guess two questions. One, going back to what you just said, Mark, I heard Johnny lay out an ARFRGen training cycle for reserve component, right, as far as training days, more training days each year, which to me seems like being a little bit of conflict with SRM because the units, Army Reserve units are going to be on the ARFRGen-like schedule to meet that requirement, vice sustainable readiness, focused readiness. But I guess the bigger question I have is when you talk about, at least from the Army Reserve and sustainment capability, we got a lot of soldiers and units that are deploying all the time because the active component is taking down a lot of sustainment structure. Do you see a force structure equation or as part of the solution here to grow more sustainment capability in the active component or more enabler capability in the active component to maybe lessen the mobilization requirements on the reserve components? Is that, you guys see that as part of the plan?
I'll field this one too. I'll take this in two bites. Your first year question referenced whether or not we're on a force generation cycle or we're doing purely sustainable readiness. It's a combination of both, and I think you would recognize that we have built a demand signal out there. We understand how much of the force we need ready at any one point in time. And so there is an element of force generation that's tied into that, where people are on a rotational cycle. One of the things under sustainable readiness is how do you extend readiness past that peak cycle if they're not used? And one of the things that changes as we go forward is the idea, the concept that as we build reserve component readiness, it may not be built purely to deploy downrange. It may be built so that we have a capability within our reserve component for unforeseen contingency. So that kind of goes into, there is an element that sustainable readiness still has a fourth generation cycle. So hopefully that kind of gets after and that gives a kind of a concept to where we're going to go in that. Now you're going to ask the harder question about rebalancing the inventory between active, guard, and reserve from a force structure standpoint in order to meet those demands. I would tell you that on an annual basis in the total Army analysis process, we look at whether or not we have too much capability or not enough capability in a given SRC or element within the Army, and then we decide, is there an opportunity to buy additional capability as we're growing the Army? A lot of what we've been doing over the last couple of years is filling holes in formations and not buying out those capabilities. So right now, I think it's something we look at on an annual basis. I don't see that we have made a move to invest in additional sustainment logistics support within the active component, which translates into the reason why we're having this conversation. How do you set the conditions such that if we have to mobilize for a contingency, do we have the right power projection platforms? Have we done the right things in mobilization force generation installations in order to allow our reserve component members, in some cases, who are called out before the active component, in order to meet the demand? So hopefully that kind of answers your question. It is something we look at all the time. No adjustments at this time.
General Richardson, Scott Sharp from actually the Army National Guard Bureau. If you would, you talked a little bit about investments we're making in enhancing reserve component organizations more ready, really about fielding equipment and bringing this up to standards. What is your perspective on the level of investment for the MFGIs so they can accept the RC units in sort of a on-demand, unanticipated order and flow, if you have any thoughts on that?
So for the MFGIs, you can do nothing, you can do some things, and you could invest everything and have them ready tomorrow. And of course, that's a balancing act. There's limited resources. And so what the Army is looking at is they're already investing in long lead time capabilities and capacity at the MFGIs. Things like internet, Centrics, things that would take a long time to, if the balloon went up, it would take a long time, months, years, to build up that MFGI. So what the Army is doing is they're prioritizing, they're looking at long lead times, and then they're investing in these MFGIs in areas that long lead times, so that stuff's taken care of, and then the things that can be done in a short lead time, overnight, we will wait until the time comes and then make those investments at that time. And so, as you watch FORCECOM, you'll see that the FORCECOM commander is personally involved in the investment in each one of these MFGIs, because he takes it on as his personal responsibility that when the Chief of Staff of the Army looks at him and says, I need these forces, he's got to be able to generate them. And so he has got his team looking at these MFGIs and doing a one-to-N on priorities, and then also looking at which ones do we have to invest in now if we want them ready on D-Day, and then what can be held off and invested in at a later date. Does that help answer that question?
It's Major General Sikano from Botswana. One of the elements of fighting power is the conceptual. So I would like you to share with us how you sustain the training of the leadership of the reservists so that when they are employed in this hybrid and multi-domain operations, they are always at par.
Sir, could you repeat the part on exactly what on the reserve component?
Yeah, I would like you to share with us how you train, how you sustain the training of the leaders of the reserve force, how you sustain that training. Because in this hybrid multi-domain environment, the leaders, it is the leadership which is very, very critical. They influence everything. So here we are talking of the reserves, and they come on rotations. Maybe after a certain time they come to have the rotation, the time of duty. But the leadership should have that sustained training, focused training. What models, what approaches have we adopted in the U.S. Army to make sure that the leadership of these people are always at par with this, with the standard which means commensurate to the active ones?
One of our challenges with the reserve component is professional military education and making sure that we get our reserve National Guard leaders to their professional education because they do have limited time. And when you pull them out to go to their professional military education, then they're not available with their unit when they are training. And so that is an ongoing challenge. And I'll probably turn to General Strong as a reserve component officer, and I think he could probably give you an idea on some of the policies and techniques that the reserve component does to maximize their leader development.
Sir, great question. So one of the things that as we look at what you're asked a reserve component member, there's individual training, the skills necessary to be proficient at the rank that you are serving at. And this is applicable to officers, it's applicable to our non-commissioned officer corps. There's also the collective training. And given a limited amount of time, and General Richardson talked about the span of increasing investment of days throughout kind of the readiness cycle. Inside of that, there's a demand signal for each of those individuals to do personal development, their professional military education. In some cases, it's in lieu of going to a collective training event. And that is a challenge. The key thing for us, and I use kind of we talk about it in the Army is kind of reps and sets, those reoccurring things that build our ability to operate and take what we've learned and go into an operational environment, having the frequency that is available to a reserve component officer or non-commissioned officer. And then the other thing that I think is key is when General Richardson showed you a slide and we talk about what we have done at our culminating training events, those CTC rotations, as we've added decisive action training and gone back to the full spectrum training, that's where the key development of our reserve component members. And it's not only limited to brigade combat teams, large formations that we have in the Army Guard. Every CTC rotation has an element of USAR or Army Reserve and Army Guard formations that may be enablers that are also going through that rotation, developing experience within the reserve component leadership. That translates into a higher level of aggregate readiness that we can apply when necessary if a contingency comes up. Hopefully that answered your question, sir.
And if there's no more questions, General Strong and I will be up here for the next 10 minutes if anyone has an individual question they'd like to come up and ask us. All right, well, thank you everybody for your participation.